Hey, everybody, welcome to today's colloquium. We're really pleased to have with us today Riley Tucker. Riley is one of our postdocs. He's joint with the Mansueto Institute and the Data Science Institute. He's in his second year here. And Riley had his PhD in criminology and justice policy from Northeastern. He got his BA at Temple. Most of his research uses computational methods and machine learning and natural language processing and web scraping to better understand cities. And he's particularly interested in developing theories and evidence around the questions of why some urban places experience more violence than others. And which leads us into today's talk. The floor is yours, Riley. Welcome aboard.
All right, thank you. All right, thanks everyone for coming out today. I'll try to get my head out of the way. So about a year ago, I was sitting in my apartment right a couple blocks away from here in Whittlelawn when the Citizen app on my phone gave me notification that there had been a homicide in the area. Within a couple of hours, I was able to get a pretty strong idea of what had happened there. It turns out that a young man who was affiliated with a gang wanted to go and taunt another gang, so he traveled to their territory. He was posting videos of themselves on Instagram showing that he had a weapon, showing that he was ready for a confrontation. Within a couple of hours, another young man found this first young man in an alley, pointed a weapon at him, and fired it several times. And so what's notable about this narrative that I just presented is it's not something that I learned from official police records or from the news, but it's actually something that I learned from a social media forum where people discuss Chicago gangs. So the point of this conversation today is that there's a lot of information online that we can use to learn about even like really hard to study topics such as gangs. However, we need some computational methods to kind of systematically analyze this content that's online. So this will really be the focus of my talk today. So outline, just kind of covering what I'm going to get into here today. First, I'm going to provide a little bit of background about the research tradition on gangs. It actually largely starts here at University of Chicago, which is pretty cool. Then I'm going to discuss specifically how some qualitative research has shown that there are some changing dynamics within Southside gangs specifically. So get into a little bit of some hyper-specific literature. Then I'm going to present a computational strategy to study gangs using this message board I just referenced, out of Chicago rap gangs. Fourth, I'm going to demonstrate the value of this data by showing some models that we can use to explain violence with this online derived content. And then fifth, I'm going to consider what can and should be done next with this kind of data that I've plugged in. So getting into the theoretical background a little bit. The study of Chicago gangs goes back very far. Basically, as long as the social sciences has been happening here at University of Chicago. So this is a really famous map that was produced by Frederick Thrasher here. He basically spent about a decade in the early 1900s trying to figure out where are all the gangs in Chicago. And so if you look on this map on the right here, each of these little red dots is a dot that Thrasher put on the map to say, okay, there's a gang here. And the reason it took Thrasher 10 years to find all this information is that he literally just had to like ask all kinds of people. You know, he was like going out to streets and talking to like the local organizers in the community centers and these kinds of things. Is there a way we can get that? Right, it was like a lot of labor to just identify specifically where are gangs in Chicago. And it took him 10 years, but through this project, Thrasher was eventually able to catalog over 1,000 gangs across Chicago, right? So kind of like a proto big data effort that just took a very, very long time. Today, we can gather data on gangs and their affiliates much more efficiently, right? Like not too many gang studies are taking 10 years, so there certainly are some. Regardless, it's still a major social science challenge. And we think of groups in society that are hard to get data on, that are unlikely to collaborate with scientists, then people involved in gangs are probably at the top of your list. However, as social scientists, we've certainly figured out ways to create knowledge. One of the major strategies is qualitative research, right? Many of you probably know there's a very rich tradition of urban ethnography, which has done a lot of work on criminal organizations. A couple of books on the right here, but in general, like many people have done these kind of qualitative research studies where you kind of hang out somewhere and get to know the local gangs and get a bunch of really rich information about them. And these kinds of studies, like I said, offer really rich information, but you tend to get small sample sizes, right? You can maybe like hang out with one gang and get to know them really, really well. But that doesn't always generalize well, it's time consuming, right? And so while there's a lot of good knowledge that can be generated from these kind of ethnographic studies, they certainly can't do it all. And so the second approach would then be to use quantitative data. And because of this challenge around collecting data on gangs, there's not exactly a lot of options for data sets to use. And what I would argue is the standard in this area is to use data from police, right? So police, just in the course of their work, as they're making arrests, they're building up data sets of who is involved in crime, where, these types of things. And then there's also just like a larger infrastructure of intelligence where police and detectives are working to understand who is in gangs, where do these gangs operate, what do they do, all these kinds of questions, right? So police data, I would argue, are really the standard for quantitative analysis on gangs. And probably one of the most popular or kind of exciting areas of police-based gang research is with networks. And so the way that this works is when police officers have a whole bunch of data of people who have been arrested, they can identify people who have been arrested together, or maybe they were just investigated together. And then you can build a network kind of approximating who knows who. And these networks have been they've really dominated the literature in terms of kind of creating new knowledge on gangs. And so some of this research is looking at truth level processes, right? So on the right here is a network map of gangs from Boston. And the idea here is that if you can kind of model, here's how the gangs are laid out, here's who is in conflict with who, here's alliances with who. With these kinds of dynamics measured, you can kind of predict crime a little bit. But also, there's this individual level body of research where people have been finding that it's not maybe as much about the conflict between gangs as much as someone's position in the individual network. So there's this idea that's kind of come out of this work that violence is contagious. If your friend is a victim of a gun homicide, then your own likelihood of being a victim is much higher, even if your friend is in a gang and you are not, right? There's this big literature, and the punchline is that network effects matter. The closer you are to violence, the more likely your own risk is. And the reason that people are really excited about this, and that it's important, is because if you can use a network to predict when someone is at risk, then you can also use that network to intervene, right? If you can see that someone is at a position in the network where the people around them are at strong risk, then you can intervene on that person and hopefully stop something bad before it happens. So that's kind of why people are really excited about building these networks and using them to kind of approximate, who's going to be a victim next time. However, while police data can show us a lot, and while it's probably the dominant choice within this literature, there are certainly some major limitations associated with it. One, police data has often been criticized for being error prone, particularly within the city of Chicago. There's been a lot of criticism of the gang databases. So for example, one thing that people have pointed to is that in their gang records, there's someone who was a gang member that had their first arrest at 80 years old, right? So there's kind of these weird idiosyncrasies that people have picked on in the gang databases. And in general, you can imagine there's a lot of opportunities for mislabeling, right? You're arresting someone and trying to guess what their affiliation is, maybe based off their tattoos and where they live, these kinds of things. There's a lot of opportunities for the police-based data to be incorrect. Second, using this data also requires partnerships with police. And maybe you all haven't had much experience kind of collaborating with agencies, but there's really only so many collaborations that agencies can have at one time. So just the fact that this data is kind of locked away in police warehouses mean that it's a small percentage of the academic community that can really reach these. It takes a lot of time to meet up with the agency, and build these relationships enough to actually get the data. So a lot of the really good data on gangs is actually completely non-open, which then creates problems for who can actually ask these kinds of questions. And then when we kind of think about these networks based on police data specifically, The police networks are based on a very specific sample of ties, right? These ties are made between two people only if they are arrested together, or maybe in some cases, the police see two people on the street together, but it's a really limited scope of all of someone's relationships. And so, we might need to think a little bit more about other kinds of network data that we can produce without some of these limitations. And indeed, it's really only one lens to view gangs through. It's very much derived from how police are understanding the gangs and the underlying dynamics. And so not all aspects may be represented. And to kind of demonstrate what I'm getting at here, I want to get into two gang phenomena specifically associated with Southside Chicago that have been kind of blind to this police-based data, but that have been researched pretty effectively through qualitative means. And so I want to look at two ways that kind of gangs have changed in Southside Chicago, kind of in the contemporary landscape. One thing that a lot of gang scholars are thinking about is how the internet has changed things. So historically, if two gangs were going to have a conflict, then two people affiliated with gangs needed to essentially like run into each other on the street or have a planned confrontation, right? This like spatial proximity was central to two people getting in conflict. However, today with social media, two people who don't like each other do not need to be in the same space to have negative interaction. I think many of us know that, right? And so there's this idea of kind of like internet beefing. Now we're on the right, you can see a bunch of images of people talking about gang homicide in Chicago. But essentially, like all the stuff that previously could only happen in person can now happen in all these new dimensions. And so there's a really big question for criminologists is, does the advent of the internet fundamentally change how gangs are operating, or just the same old beefs and same old conflicts that are just happening online instead of in person? And so while this is definitely kind of a hot area of research, another contemporary change that I would argue has been less well covered by the gang researchers is the way that socioeconomics have been changing in America over the last several decades. So for one, there's been an increase in concentrated poverty over the last several decades for urban communities. And if you look at the graph on the right here, it specifically suggests that this is impacting Black communities in north central cities such as Chicago, right? So urban communities are in general less well off. There's also been a lot of displacement via public housing closure and gentrification. So on the right here is an image of the Robert Taylor homes, which Sudhir Venkatesh famously studied in his Gang Leader for a Day book. And here we can see it being knocked down, right? So if you're not familiar with Sudhir's book, he spent a long time interviewing all of people from this one project who were in a gang together. Now that project housing has been demolished, all of these people had to relocate, right? So all these people who were in a gang together because they lived in the same building all of a sudden have been displaced all across Chicago, right? So these socioeconomic changes have been impacting the gangs. And one of the major ways that this has impacted modern day Chicago gangs is the impact on the profitability of illicit trade. So there's some gang scholars who have argued that in the 90s, when gangs were kind of like at their height in many cities, gangs were essentially drug dealing businesses, is how the theorists argue about it. And so if you were in a gang, the incentive was just to make a lot of money selling crack, essentially how it's argued. However, with these socioeconomic changes that I referenced, it's not as easy to make money through drug transactions anymore. So there's simply lower demand for crack cocaine in contemporary America. So you just like can't sell as much drugs or high profit drugs, right? You can sell marijuana, but the profit margins on marijuana are not nearly as high as crack. And then similarly, organizations have been broken down by law enforcement and neighborhood change, right? These socioeconomic changes are just causing the gangs to fracture, it has been argued. And so what I want to get into is that these two kind of changes, right? How gangs are using the internet and how gangs are being impacted by socioeconomic change. These have been written about in ethnographies, but they would be very, very challenging to study through quantitative methods traditionally. And to show why this matters, I want to show what I argue are kind of like two intertwined outcomes that are taking place in contemporary Chicago as a result of this like increase in internet access and socioeconomic change. And right, so one of these that I just mentioned was that gangs are fracturing. So this is a big finding from a ethnography done by Rob Asfalm right down here in the south side. And basically what he argues is that because of what I was just talking about the profitability of gangs being reduced, all these things, is that gangs are fracturing. So the argument that he makes is if we look in this diagram on the right here, the kind of classic, the big crack selling business is the nation level, right? And you can think of these as really big gangs that are operating in the 90s. What Asfalm argues is that because of these socio-demographic processes, these large nations have split into smaller firms. So if we look at the, sorry, I'm struggling with my light here. If we look at the second row, these are what are called as sets. And you can think of these as a small gang, and we'll see in a little bit, their turf may just occupy a couple of city blocks, right? So we have these old nation gangs that have split into smaller sets, and then we have individuals who are associated with specific sets. And notably, an argument that comes out of these fracturing of gangs is that gang theorists are arguing that affiliations themselves are losing importance. The behaviors of individuals is not nearly as connected to dynamics of their set or dynamics of the nation that they're associated with. And to really summarize this, there's this phrase that comes up in these gang spaces called EBK, which stands for everybody killer. And it's the idea that violence in contemporary Chicago is not about people, attacking other people because of who they're affiliated with. It's about interpersonal conflict, right? It's about the network rather than these kind of larger factions that people are affiliated with. So this is one kind of argument that has been taking place in the literature. And second, we've had to think about what happens with this void that comes from not being able to make money from selling crack. And so there's a really great ethnography from Forrest Stewart, who argues that because Southside gangs can't make money selling drugs, they've searched out for this alternative form of income through drill rap, which is a musical genre of music, largely popularized by Chief Keef. I imagine many of you, but probably not all of you, are at least vaguely familiar with him. Right, and so if you're not familiar with this this musical genre, it's a style of rap that is explicitly highlighting kind of gang conflicts and affiliation. So you can kind of listen to a drill rap song and you'll often have the rapper talking about like what gang they're a part of, what gang they don't like, who is in their gang, like who they want to attack, all these kinds of things, right? So it's like very, very explicit that this is music that is connected to gang disputes. And while it's like highly specific to stuff going on in Southside Chicago, largely thanks to Chief Keef and a couple others, this music now has a global audience, right? You can, there's drill artists all over the world. I was at a conference a couple months ago and there was someone giving a presentation all about London drill rappers, right? So it's like a true global thing that started in Chicago. And notably, Stewart argues from his ethnography, he did a little survey, 69% of Southside gangs are utilizing YouTube to create this kind of content. So the drill rap is like a relatively common way, or like a common behavioral mode for gangs at least. But what's really interesting is that Stewart's kind of punchline is that the stuff in the drill rap videos is oftentimes not real. Because people can make money from putting these products out there, there's a lot of incentive for people to dramatize what they're up to. Kind of this idea that just because someone is in a drill rap video with a gun does not mean they're actually someone who shoots weapons in their free times, right? And so it's like a really important thing to keep in mind. And so on the next slide, I'm going to show a couple pieces of this drill rap content. I thought a lot about whether or not I should show it because I do understand that like there's opportunity to kind of like stigmatize communities, especially when we know the imagery is not real. But I think it's really important to know like what data is kind of ultimately going into the online courses that I'm analyzing. So I'm going to show just a couple. There are a couple images of young men with guns, so just wanted to warn you about that. And so the reason that there is so much incentive for young guys in Chicago to make these kinds of online content is you can get a ton of attention. And so like rare success can be real mainstream fame. So on the right here is one of like the more well-known drill rap songs. And if you look in the lower left corner, I know it's hard to see. This video accrued over 52 million views in 4 years, right? So that's like serious, like, it's not just like some niche musical genre. It's like a lot of people are paying attention to this. And Forrest Stewart argues that this is taking place under a process of digital commodification of violence, where fans who are listening to this content are specifically gravitating towards pieces that reference real life violence and gang ties, right? This kind of idea that the more authentic drill rap appears, the more fans are going to kind of gravitate towards that. And so on the right here is a video called 51 Dead Ops. If you can't quite parse what that means, essentially means like 51 dead enemies. And in the song, this rapper names off like 51 people who have died to gang violence, right? So it's like kind of like this authenticity, right? Like this is like something that really happened. And notably, I guess I don't have a box for that, but it has almost 10 million views in 5 years, right? So people really enjoy this content. But what's fascinating to me is that these fans who are consuming this content, they're buying into the authenticity, are then developing their own online fan spaces where they discuss not only the rap music, but also how it connects to real life. And so this is really a process of crowdsourced research where people are kind of like combing through the songs and also the social media associated with the artist, the news, really trying to figure out like, okay, is this thing that was explained in the song, was that a real life event, or are they capping, is what they might say, are they lying, kind of making something up? And what's really interesting is some users have even become savvy enough to do FOIA requests. So they'll like make these requests to the Chicago Police Department where they say, hey, I want to know about this incident that happened on this day. They've actually like tailored these FOIA requests enough that they get them. So there's like this really big process of informational verification going on. And to kind of like demonstrate how this verified information then gets out in the world, some like random person on YouTube made this video in response to the 51 Dead Ops video. Every person dissing 51 Dead Ops. And it's a video that catalogs, here's the 51 real people that are referenced in the song. So there's this really big process of information is being put out in the music, and then people online are kind of making sense of all of the cookie crumbs, as it were. And to me, this creates a really interesting kind of like data phenomenon to dig into. Because on one hand, you have guys that are putting all of these content online, claiming to be authentic and depicting violence. But really, according to Stewart's ethnography, which is the best source we have on this, it's all dramatized, right? It's like really not real, at least like the behavior of the people in the videos. But then you have people online, it could be UChicago undergrads or like anyone out in the world, right? And these people are consuming it and taking it at face value. And then they create their own spaces where it is only their perspective that's left over, right? And so it's like this kind of question is there enough, kind of valid information that starts in these videos that even with all these filters going on where the information should be bad quality, is there anything kind of like valid that we can still learn from the spaces that are kind of developed by these actors who are not as directly knowledgeable as you might hope for in general? And so what can we learn? I think that the reason that there's like something that we can really capitalize on here is that the internet is a platform for identities to be symbolized. This is true for everyone, not just gang affiliated people. But in terms of gang affiliated people, symbolizing your identity can mean putting a hashtag with your set on it, right? Or naming your gang aliens, right? And so in all this content, people are kind of like putting out who they are. And so while depictions of violence could be sensationalized, right? These guys pointing weapons aren't really planning to fire them. The underlying affiliations network can still be legitimate, right? People are still filming rap videos with their friends at the end of the day, right? And especially when like the online crowd is verifying and kind of throwing out the bad information. And so I argue that this data set is a really kind of novel way to dig into these kind of like lower scale set affiliations. And it's important because these like set affiliations, right, the small gangs, are something that Chicago Police Department really struggles to keep track of. So on the right here is a table of data from CPD, people who passed away. And if we look at the column for Nation, right, those old gangs from the 90s, almost every row you can see has a label. But then if we look at the column for sets, it's almost completely empty. Like I didn't like cherry pick this image, this is just kind of like what the data looked like. So these like lower scale stats are something that's like really hard for the police to measure, even though the qualitative theorists were saying, oh, this is really where like the action is at now. Right. And so, if there's other data that we can use to make sense of this, it would be information. And so my research questions here is, can crowdsourced data be computationally processed to produce valid information about gangs? And how do sets and nations work together to shape social networks and individual outcomes? Before I go on, do anyone have any questions? I know we normally do like questions in the middle, and I'm happy to do that if anyone is like itching or anything. If everyone has no questions, I'll just go on. Okay, well, if you want to interrupt me in the next part, feel free. So getting into the data set here. The starting point for the study was a social media forum started in 2017 that was started to discuss Chicago drill rap and gangs. And so initially this took off very slow. In 2017, there weren't even enough posts for us to analyze. By today, there's almost 250,000 followers. To me, as far as I know, it's the largest forum of its kind that's specifically, people talking about specific gangs, specific gang conflicts. And so there's a couple frequent types of forum posts that come up on here. Probably the most common are these first two. So oftentimes users will post pictures of gang affiliated people, two guys in an Instagram picture together, and then they'll have like a post title that kind of, captions what's going on. Then you also have purely text types of posts. Someone will maybe raise a question or an observation about some gang affiliated people, and then there'll be like a set of paragraphs or sentences that kind of pose some idea that people can discuss. And importantly, when you have a really big message board like this, you always get spam. And so I just wanted to note that not every single post on here is all about the gang activity, right? Of course, you have people talking about the music itself. But then you also have, I don't know, people talking about their girlfriends and all this stuff. It's just like a really lively social media forum.
Riley, is this by gang people, for gang people, or by the university or the police, or who's initiating this?
The writer, you mean the
The
users?
forum.
So it's fans of fans of the rap and fans of gangs. The line between them is very, very thin because of the type of interest that they take. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's hard, because my sense is that there are people that are in Chicago gangs that have found their way to this page, but I think for sure, there's kind of this trope that everyone's in Europe. You'll see people screenshot something from Instagram and the language will be French. You know what I mean? So it's I think it's it leans to a mainstream global audience rather than people that are involved in games. All right, so with this forum, since it's pretty popular, between January 2018 and March 2023, we were able to extract 281,000 post titles. So just the titles of the post, right? And so I thought if there is any kind of valid information in this data set, then the low hanging fruit would be to learn these three things. Who are the gang affiliated individuals that are followed by the message board? Which gang set are they affiliated with? And then where is each set located in Chicago? And so I argue to do this, we need a computational approach. It simply would not be feasible for me to read 281,000 post titles. I'd be on the Thrasher 10-year schedule for sure. Additionally, kind of there's some ways a basic text search could be done to look for names, but you really need a list of names to start with. And so you really need a hands-off strategy to analyze these texts so I can make sense of these 281,000 posts within my 2-year contract. And so for this, we've settled on what's called parts of speech tagging. If you're not familiar, this type of algorithm that can take a segment of set words and break it into its grammatical building blocks. So here it takes the sentence, I like to read books, and it's able to say, okay, here's the verbs here, here's the nouns, etc. Right? So you can just break down sentence grammatically. And so while it works with these really clean, easy to read sentences like I like to read books, it can also work really well with the messy text that comes from the social media forum. And so this is an example of a post that was written by me. We can talk more at some point if you want to know why I picked my sentences instead of theirs. Essentially, this is the typical format of a post title on this forum. People will name an individual associated with a gang. Then in brackets, they will name the gang that person is affiliated with, and then the rest of the sentence occurs. Or, this stuff could be in the middle as well. Sure.
You're only focusing on the titles of all the posts?
Yeah.
How common is it for the content of the post to be implied by the title versus I have a thought about Chicago gangs, which tells you nothing, and then everything.
We're only looking for people, right? So we're just looking for proper nouns right now.
Okay.
That makes sense.
But it's common. What percent of people's names do you think you're missing by not looking into the body of the posts, just the titles?
Oh, I'd assume that that's a really hard thing to say, but I would assume that in general, they would raise you know, maybe if like the post title is about like this set, then maybe there's like some people from that set that aren't, but if it, I would assume normally it's like, you know, T-Bone and Bugs. I don't know, it's, you know, I mean, T-Bone and Bugs had this thing happen and the conversation is about them. For sure, some of it is missing. But there's a lot that we can do with sentences, you know, so I haven't been super concerned about kind of like getting that text back in. All right, and so as I mentioned before, from these sentences, you know, we kind of want to get two things out of it, right? Like who's the person and what's their set. And so getting the individuals out of here is relatively straightforward with the parts of speech tagger. We just look for proper nouns because we're treating the sentences grammatically rather than like looking for known names, that even if a gang alias doesn't look like what I would traditionally expect a name to look like, it's able to flag the proper noun. Right, so we're able to get the names out that way. And then because, and I can't stress, like the users are so good about labeling the sets systematically. I'm sure we missed some of them, but it's like very, very standard that anytime they're naming an individual, they'll like name the set in parentheses or brackets like that. And so to pull out the affiliations from sentences, it's really as easy as just kind of like pulling out text segments that are between parentheses and brackets. And now granted, you know, there's a lot of opportunity for error to happen here or for mislabeling to happen. And so we use kind of a probabilistic approach to make sense of that. And so individuals are mentioned with their affiliation across many posts. Here's the example of T-Bone again, who I've made up, by the way, or he's from Game Over for the Day. And so you can see T-Bone was mentioned 6 times. 5 times the users correctly labeled him as a measure of the as a member of Black Kings. Then one person labeled him as corner boys. And there's a lot of reason that could happen, right? The user might just like not know the true set. The user could be trolling. But anyways, you definitely can't take these at face value. You needed to, you know, create a strategy that will allow for wiggle room for crowd discrepancies where we don't throw out every little discrepancies, but we use the information that is most kind of probable to be good quality. And so for this, we settled on a 70% threshold, where if a given alias is mentioned 5 or more times, and there is a dominant affiliation that appears in 70% or more of posts, then we link T-Bone to the Black Kings, right? Like in this example where 5 out of 6 of T-Bone's posts are about Black Kings, we say, okay, we'll get rid of the corner boys post and assume that person was just like, didn't know what they were talking about, and we'll consider T-Bone to be affiliated with the Black Kings. And so if we use just this kind of basic strategy, we get a raw data set of 64 gangs, which sounds great, right? That's like a lot of data right there. However, many of these sets only have 1 or 2 affiliates associated with them. There's different ways this could be interpreted. Like Thrasher did have a section in his book about 2 or 3 people gangs. So there is technically some academic theory on small gangs. I didn't really interpret it this way. I assume that there's like some gangs that the user just like aren't as knowledgeable about. And so maybe they know like the most popular people from those gangs, but they don't really kind of know everything. And so I assume in these situations, it's a weak signal issue, right? We just can't trust the crowd for information about these gangs. And so to kind of toss out the gangs that I think we couldn't really conclusively know about, I use kind of like a 2-pronged strategy here. The first is to only use these large sets where there's 10 or more affiliates. You know, the idea being that if there's 10 or more people, then the crowd probably has like pretty good information about this gang. And then I only analyze sets that are known to CPD. I can see this going either way, but my thinking is that if a set is a large gang and they're involved in crime, then they're the most likely gangs to be known to CPD. And the benefit of this is that it allows me to remove gangs that are large but non-criminal. So for example, there's a really large group of affiliates that are identified by this algorithm, and it's actually like a rap group, not the gang. Granted, a lot of these people in the kind of like musical enterprise are also in gangs, but the musical enterprise is not their affiliation, right? So like we need a little bit of kind of like counterbalancing to make sure that we're really focusing on criminal organizations. And so, you know, there's like a lot of opportunities here to kind of think about the method differently. But the way I'm thinking about it is that I'm focusing on the most famous sets, right? If a gang is known by both the police and both the random people online, then these are the gangs in Chicago that we kind of have the highest likelihood of getting high quality data for, right? I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm just saying these are the groups that we should be able to say the most about accurately. And so this gives a data set of 270 individuals affiliated with 11 gangs in Chicago. Is everyone following so far? And so since the people at the police data are doing all this cool network stuff, I too want to do cool network stuff. And so to create a network, we assume that there's a tie between two individuals if they are mentioned together in at least one post together. So in this example, we have a post where T-Bone is mentioned in the same post as C-Note. And so we assume that there's a social tie between these two individuals. Using that process, we get a social network that looks like this. So these are the 270 individuals, and we have 11 colors representing the different 11 gangs there. And then here is a distribution of edges. It's a scale-free distribution. I don't know if there's any like network nerds here. If anyone wants to talk about why I think we have a scale-free distribution, we can get into it. And so in addition to thinking about this as a social network, we can also think about it as a geographic network. And the reason, got myself turned around there. And so the reason that I can study this is because the forum users are not only making posts, but they're actually maintaining a publicly available Google map where they record the polygons associated with different gangs. And so what I did is I took down this data as a KML, just download it. I, based on the names of sets, I merged their polygons to the set names I identified through our algorithm, and I was able to identify these 11 polygons that are the gangs that I'm studying. It's really interesting, and I don't know if it's coincidental or not. So these are all very clustered around the University of Chicago. Of course, we're like here right now. My hand's shaking, so I can't fully get it. But right, like this is our area right here. And so what do I want to say about this? Right, so we have each polygon is a different gang, and we can also understand which nation they're from, right? Just to go back a second here, the polygons from the social media forum are all sets, right? But Chicago Police Department does have a data set where they kind of show, okay, these sets spawn from which nations. And so the colors on this map here indicate which nation each set spawned from. And it's really interesting because you can see, like, just like visually, there's these clusters where like these green polygons all came from the same nation, right? These are like smaller factions that fractured. And then you can see kind of a similar pattern over here with the red polygons. And then this one's kind of cut off there. And so I was really interested in this question of whether my social network correlates with my geographic network. And in a way, I kind of thought of this as a validation exercise, because right, in general, in the social sciences, there's expectation that if two people are closer together in space, they're more likely to interact. So if my network is kind of accurately capturing how much people are interacting, assuming that gang, dynamics are following the same structure, then two people who are mentioned together on the message board should like theoretically be closer together on average. And so to approach this, I started by running some clustering on my social network, right? So basically creating sub-communities. We have 5 colors here, and each color indicates a sub-community where all the people within that group are more strongly connected to each other than the rest of the network, right? Cliques they sometimes get referred to as, or it's similar concept at least. And so with like knowing who is in these 5 kind of like social groups that are socially based, not kind of linguistically based, we can then map the presence of each social community across geographies to see if community members are more spatially clustered together. And so here we have 5 maps. Each of these maps is for a different social community, and the polygons that are darker maroon or red are the polygons that have more affiliates from a given set. And so there's 2 kind of main patterns of gender. One, if we look at community 3 and community 4, we have social communities where almost all of the individuals come from the same set, right? So this kind of gets at that old school way of thinking about gangs, right? Everyone who is in a gang are really close to each other. There's another gang on like the other side of the railroad tracks who they are not interacting with, right? So that's kind of how people would classically think of gangs. But then if we look at communities 1 and 2, we can actually see that these are communities that are made of multiple sets, right? Even though these are 2 different gangs, you have people who are being socially connected to each other. And notably, these connections are spatially clustered, right? It's like the people who are in different gangs next to each other are all kind of like socially connected. And notably, if we look at community 1, you can see that we have these like 3 polygons that are, oops, whoa, I don't know what that happened. Whoa, words. If we look at community 1, you can see that there's these 3 polygons that are next to each other, and then there's a gap in this 4th one up here. All 4 of those are actually from the same nation, right? So you get this really interesting kind of picture of, okay, there was these really big organizations in the 90s, and they've fractured, and that fracturing is still kind of dictating the social structure of gangs. And so overall, I thought that all these kind of validation exercises suggested that the data was performing pretty well. I guess there was some validation stuff I didn't show, but trust me, there's good validation stuff. We're gonna do it after. But in any case, I was convinced that this data was good quality. So I wanted to kind of think about, like, if we're pushing the limits of it, like, what can we really do? And since people using these networks are doing all of this stuff, like predicting violence, I wondered if we could do something similar with seeing if like the social network from the crowdsourced media forum is also predictive of violence. And the reason that I can do this is because another data product that the users maintain is a table of every person who, according to them, has died to gang violence. And so this is like an actual screenshot of a table from this forum. And so because you get a nickname and you also get like a news article verifying that this really happened, you can merge the nicknames here to the names that we extracted from the NLP algorithm. And you can actually identify which people in the social network have passed away according to the social media users. And so in addition to just kind of seeing like, oh, does my network perform the same way that the police networks do? I also wanted to see like how we can leverage this information a little bit. And I kind of wanted to think of it as a multi-level problem where, you know, there's a lot of evidence that people's individual position in the network matters, but is affiliation with certain sets or certain nations more riskier than being in other gangs? You can kind of control for someone's position in the network. And so I approached this using a multi-level model. Basically allows me to like nest an individual in their context. And with these kinds of models, you can do what's called variance decomposition. I don't know how much I need to get into it right now, but essentially you can analyze an empty model and get something like an R squared for each level of analysis that tells you like how much each nested level matters. And what I found doing this exercise with this data is that very little variation in individual mortality is explained by either the set that someone belongs to or the nation, right? So just like from empty model analysis, I got some evidence that it's really like an individual level phenomena driving mortality in the first place. But then we can actually get into the full models here. These are some metrics that I based off the work of like Papachristos and colleagues. These are kind of like me trying to approximate network measures from previous literature. And indeed, a couple of these network measures from the crowdsourced social network are predictive of mortality. So the more central someone is in the social network, the higher their risk is. The higher the percentage of an individual's direct neighbors who are deceased also, right? So these are just kind of 2 like contagion of violence stories repeated. One that was interesting is that we created a variable representing the percentage of someone's direct neighbors who are within the same gang, thinking that like, oh, if gangs are in conflict, the more neighbors you have in other gangs, the higher your risk is going to be. However, that didn't really shake out in this. And to me, it's another little piece of evidence that, oh, set and nation dynamics are not really driving mortality. It's really about kind of this individual position in the network and someone's specific kind of situation, who they're interacting with, what's going on there, rather than these like big picture kind of gang faction things playing out. And so a couple takeaways from these analyses. Overall, I think the crowdsourced data appears to capture really rich information about a specific subset of gangs in Chicago, right? I want to be clear, this is not representative, right? If we go back 100 years, Thrasher found 1,000. I'm not sure there's 1,000 gangs in Chicago today, but there's much more than 11. We can be certain of that. But I think we can still do really good research on these 11 gangs, given the richness of information. I think the analysis suggests that affiliations are losing relevance, really kind of like supporting Rob Asfalm's argument about how the nations have fractured into sets. And so I think that this could be a useful tool for interventions. On the right here are build workers. So these are guys in an organization who their job is kind of to intervene when a gang conflict is about to emerge. You can imagine that social workers are saying, hey, like person A is in a risky situation right now. We need someone to go out and talk to them, right? And then you can like intervene and have these guys who generally like they have some, past experience with gangs go out and talk to them. And so the online content could be another way to kind of cue in to kind of, invested parties that, oh, someone is at trouble. We need to like do something on this part of the network. Then finally, it's also a potential alternative to police-based data. I do believe that kind of people working with police really have a monopoly on these kinds of data sets and answering these kinds of questions. And in general, my philosophy is that wider data access allows a more varied set of perspectives to emerge, and that this is probably a really important topic that we need people from different perspectives researching. So I think that creating kinds of data that can be more like publicly available would be good for the academy. And so I don't know how I'm doing on time here. Okay. I have 15 minutes. Okay, so I can still talk and time for questions. I just want to get into a couple future directions I see coming from this. So one thing that I definitely want to tap into next is getting into temporal analyses, right? I've like just treated this as a big cross section across 5 years, but tracking posts over time may also be informative. So this is a plot of how a single individual is being discussed month by month. And we can see, like this is a person that the forum didn't really care about, but then I guess it's like the beginning of 2021, all of a sudden this person got a whole lot of attention. And because we have the mortality data, right, with a date on it, we can see when someone passes away. And if you look, the month that this person passed away was like following this really big spike at the beginning of the year. And indeed, we can find multiple instances of these kinds of trends where we see someone gets like a whole lot of discussion like around the time they die, and then it kind of looks like there's like some stuff after they die where they're like more popular. And so tracking trajectories of posts, like not even getting into the actual content, could be another kind of cue, like, oh, the social media forums are talking about this guy a lot, like he's might be doing something risky that we need someone to kind of like see if they can get him back on the line of not being risky. Another kind of like big fish to fry here is to get a better understanding of the social ties. Right, in the current study, the ties are completely ambiguous. Like we don't really know why two users or one user was naming two individuals together. To me, the ambiguity in these ties actually kind of suggests that the network ties are really strong. Like if we can still predict mortality through these ambiguous ties, then it suggests that we could like really explain a lot with honing in on these ties a little bit more. So it's definitely something I'm interested to do. And I see that there's like a couple different aspects of ties that might be kind of an interesting starting point. The first would be identifying whether two people in a tie are friends or enemies, right? You can imagine that if we're trying to predict violence, the negative interactions network may be a lot more predictive than the positive interactions network. It would also be interesting to know, just like when two people are being named in a musical context, I thought this YouTube screenshot was kind of a good example. I can imagine if I like fed this like title of New York drill versus Chicago drill into like LLM, then it's like, oh yeah, this is like conflict between factions, but this is purely like a musical post, so if we could kind of like dig into the text a little bit, just to like toss out the purely musical conversation post, that might improve measurement a little bit. And then also kind of, building up on the first next steps here, is it would be really interesting to think about how network ties change over time. Because to me, that's kind of like how you would capture this like gang refracturing, right? Would be actually see like, okay, user A was hanging out with like users or people B, C, D in the first half of the year. And then all of a sudden they're hanging out with like EFG, you know what I mean? Like that is what changing gang would look like. So I think that analyzing how the network structure and people's within it changes from month to month, for example, could be informative. And so there's a little bit of a problem here. and this is what I'll end on here, is that with all the text, all of like the rage these days is about the large language models in the ChatGPT. And so like one could argue that the most powerful strategy for me to make sense of these posts I collected would just be to like feed them into a large language model. And so I mean, here's actually like a prototype of what that would look like on the right here. I've developed a prompt where I give it some basic instructions and I say, please let me know whether you think the two individuals named in this post are friends or enemies, right? And I feed it the one of my example sentences, and ChatGPT is actually able to give like a really good nuanced kind of summary of what goes on in that post. However, the problem here is that this was a post written by me using my natural language. And there's a big problem in the computer sciences that people are still kind of trying to figure out how to move forward with. The natural language processing tools are not trained on African-American vernacular English. And really basic examples, right? So here's a paper where they basically compared toxicity measures between kind of like, white language and African-American vernacular language. And they found that the same sentiment, if you change it from white speech to black speech, the black speech all of a sudden is way more toxic, right? And like this toxicity detection stuff is something that like big companies are pouring like millions and probably billions of dollars into, right? And so if the tools that are available on the market right now are not prepared to do this kind of simple task of toxicity, I don't see how you could possibly expect ChatGPT to get good information out of like a social media forum that's all about kind of like Southside gang slang. And so the way to fix this would be we'd actually need to develop a text corpora of African-American vernacular English. So what that means is getting text, produced by African-American people, annotated by people who also use the speech. And so with the gang research specifically, like that's not quite enough, right? If we were going to properly do this with the gang research, I think that really what would need to happen is we would need to work with gang affiliated people, showing them posts from forums like this and having those young people label the post being like, oh, here's what's going on in this post, right? Rather than kind of like relying on people like me, like a white man from the suburbs who's never been in a gang, right? So I think really kind of like, I guess like the broad theme I wanted to leave you with here is that research needs to be collaborative. Like if we're studying communities, we should be kind of like working to integrate their perspective. And so that's where I'm really seeing like the big picture of this project going from here on out. And so thank you everyone. I'd be remiss if I didn't kind of show off my awesome teammates here over at the Environmental Neuroscience Lab. And then thank you.
Thank you. This is exciting. The typical focus of work like this tends to be on crime. The way you're telling the story makes me wonder if you could also look at this question of getting attention and using all this the activity to get more likes and the associated perks that come with this, which might be closer to the perspective of part of why people engage in this.
Totally. We've actually had like an RA start to do that a little bit. Like we've like had someone look up every name on this website called Rap Genius for rap lyrics. So like we have like a dummy variable for whether or not anyone has been like a prominent enough rapper to like end up online. And then we also have like some kind of like clout metrics, like how many people edited their bio on the lyric website and like these kinds of things. So I think that's definitely like another line of inquiry, is like thinking about how the rap kind of like clout is like feeding back into all the social network kind of like crime stuff. Yeah. Chris, please.
I got two questions, sort of a conceptual question and a empirical one. I guess the conceptual question is the model of gangs that you're talking about is interesting and very different from, as you said, the kind of territorial drug trade based model. So I'm just curious, what is the underlying nature of the conflict between gangs in this world? Like under the territorial drug trade world, the nature of the conflict was we control this territory, we're making money from this territory by selling drugs there, and if someone else takes this, they're taking our money, so we have conflict. What's the nature of conflict when what we're posting is just songs? Like why would two gangs?
So I guess like that's like I can see how I kind of like didn't get into enough of the content to depict this. So a lot of like the rap songs themselves are like incitements of violence directly. So there's like a really big.
But why? I guess I'm asking. Like,
oh, sure. So you want to get past that? Yeah. So I mean, like to me, I think like a big part of it, it's like hypermasculinity and like machismo kind of playing out. And I think like some of it is also heavily contextual, you know, like it's not only in the south side of Chicago where young guys are engaging in like hypermasculine behavior, but I think something contextual, and like this kind of gets back into like the structural argument that I presented in the beginning. It's like something about being in Southside Chicago kind of like aggravates these beefs when like someone's at that age and that kind of like time of life. And it's like fascinating because if you even look to the west side of Chicago, like they don't have the same kind of stuff going on. Like for whatever reason, the west side gangs have still been able to like stay afloat selling drugs. So like even within Chicago, there's like these big differences in driving things. And yeah, I mean, I certainly don't have like evidence about kind of like what's driving like the underlying behavior here, but I mean, it's certainly kind of like the big question.
Because that was my question.
Sure.
And then, like empirically, it seems like what you've shown is some measure of the extent to which this particular web forum can generate information about some particular sort of gangs. And the question you posed at the beginning was broader than that. Source data, just generally. So I guess what we don't know from this is like, is this do other cities, you know, have like how generalizable is this? Can we use this for anything else? Like people might stop using this forum next week and different users come in or go out and the nature of the data changes, or you know, we could try to go to some other city and is it useless? So is there any it seems like from the way you described it that the people posting on this forum are themselves just digesting data that's already been posted online somewhere else. It's not, we don't think, as I heard you explain it, they have their own independent information on what the gangs are doing, that they're bringing to the forum, but rather they're watching YouTube videos or whatever. Is it possible to just go to the underlying source itself rather than using the forum?
You certainly could. I mean, getting data access to things like Instagram is hard, but you do lose out a little bit on this like crowdsource verification stuff, you know, like you're taking it a little bit more at face value if it's not getting like digested through all these screeners of people who are inaccurate.
But when you say verification, do you mean verification or what do you mean?
I mean, I would think of it as being a verification. Like if you have a group of people who are like working out facts about a topic, I mean, I guess, I don't know, what would you call it if not verification?
Because I don't know what's on that forum.
Yeah.
You want us to think that everything that appears there is somehow verified in the sense of being fact-checked?
I mean, not, well, I mean, kind of, I mean, there's like they're FOIAing requests. I mean, it's like, it's hard to say without like specific types of data. I feel like I've focused on an aspect of the data that is pretty like easily verifiable, you know, it's just kind of like proper nouns connected to gangs that are known by CPD. I mean, to your like bigger question here about kind of like, is this the only forum or like, does it stop here if the forum closes? So like on this platform, there's forum about many different cities, but I think like the bigger thing of what I'm showing here is a heuristic for making sense of the online content. Like these kind of things I've shown, it could work for the forum I'm looking at. They could work for Instagram posts or Facebook posts or like whatever other, I mean, there's like many other forums out here that exist and forums that could exist. So to me, I think really like the contribution here is demonstration of that we can make sense of these things online, not necessarily that this forum is like the end all be all of studying gangs.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I think your question around sort of like assessing validity of these like crowdsourced data points is really interesting. I guess I'm like thinking about the context of like gang databases run by police departments, coming from like working in public defense and having a bunch of clients who like really did not have affiliations beyond the gang database in New York City and like FOIA requesting themselves to learn that they were. And so I'm thinking about that in the context of Chicago, which has been sued for their like wildly inaccurate gang database that includes like a 9-year-old. And so I just am wondering about how you're relating to the CPD data as like a source of sort of cross-checking or the validity of that data.
It's hard, right? Because I think like my experience with like other kinds of online data sets is that people just do not trust that they're valid without like showing some ground truth, which is like good for the sciences, you know? But with like the gangs, right, the ground truth is like extremely elusive. So I didn't even know like what other I mean, like there's like the qualitative route, right, for confirming some of these things. But short of that, I didn't know like what other ground truth I could pull from. And so like, it's like clearly like a limitation of what's possible. I was very conscientious throughout, you know, to try to only maintain the data that seemed to be like the highest quality based on kind of like my theory of the data. But certainly, I mean, it's challenging, you know what I mean? Like, it's just like a hard thing to know like what is real. And so that's what I've been struggling with. I kind of decided like, okay, the police data is probably reasonable for like a scientific audience.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I also feel like this is maybe just like, you know, unintentionally, like a really interesting alternative to the police data, even if that's the unintended consequence or maybe intended consequence for users on this forum.
Is there a question back there before?
Yeah, so I had a question, it was really interesting, but for me, I'm talking about, you talk about different levels of data, you talk about nation and maybe I'm talking about more individual data. When you do NLP and then you take crowdsourced data about it and a particular individual from various places online, how do you account for the bias that exists in terms of, I'm looking in terms of gangs as well, where there's this one group who's out to target this one person. They like gang and they post different posts about it on the forum. And like how do you authenticate that person's validity on an individual level? Maybe like on a gang level, I find like authenticity on a gang level would be much better than on the individual level. Is that true? Did that data show you?
Well, I mean, we don't really have like too much ground truth for the users, you know, that's like where we have to like have a little like faith in the data approach here. I mean, like with like the gangs, right? Like those are directly verified, right? Because we look at the Chicago Police Department data and we assume that the ground truth on that is good enough, you know, but we don't know for sure. And to your point, did you say something about it coming from like different forums?
Yeah,
Is that
but,
part?
like,
So it all comes from like a single text source, so that helps. And we have thought about like how would you kind of like rate a forum user on how likely their information is to be judged quality. I don't know if it's just like the users that are posting the most. I don't know if we could like find like some ground truth thing. We could be like, what percentage of like users posts like are actually accurate. We need to be really clever about thinking like what claim from the users are we vetting. But yeah, it's a hard to know at the user level for sure. So here and here.
Yeah, and not to beat the validity horse too far, but like considering that there is public data from the Chicago Police Department, I can pull up the gang maps right now. Is there a possibility the gangs are actually using this information to like purposely social engineer like distractors for the police to mask other kind of gang activity?
I'm not concerned about that being a thing.
Okay.
Have you spoken to anyone, like maybe any young people in Chicago who use this phone?
No, I'd love to, and like, I don't even know, I mean, like, I don't just know, like, are young people in Chicago really using this forum at all? Cause like, this is like clearly not where like the gang conflict is happening, you know, it's like Instagram, I think is like the main thing where like if you're gonna ask, like, are you getting, like, you know, young guys, like, are you getting involved in gang conflict online? You'd probably be like, are you on Instagram? But I mean, it would be fascinating to know just like how much awareness of it. I think like there was like a pretty big trial over the last couple months that was like a federal trial of some of these gangs, and I think the forum came up in court. So it's like pretty well known, but I don't know how much like the people on the south side are looking at it.
More about how you work, like what.
Yeah, I can go back to the visual there. Oops, no way.
Is it just like if they're mentioned at all?
Yeah, it is like literally just like the like rawest NLP measure that you can imagine. Like we have a list of proper nouns that are in the data. If those two proper nouns appear in at least one post together, then there's an edge.
So if there's like 100 posts about two people and then like one post about another, they both just have one edge.
So we did that for like the mean regression. That is the case because we were kind of like replicating what people have done with other like other network kind of metrics in the space. However, we did create some measures that are like weighted on like exactly what you're talking about. You know, like if two people are mentioned 100 times together, we assume that they have a stronger relationship. And at least like within the regression, those kind of more weighted measures didn't really like change results or come through.
Like, are they usually in relationships like one person is like dating a person is like, oh, this person is my best friends.
We have no idea. It's like we would need to like come up with a strategy for tagging, like categorizing the post to get there. It's like really like I had like spent like a lot of time reading this forum, and couldn't even tell you like which way I think the needle leans on that. You know what I mean? Because there's like so many different kinds of content, but it would be really interesting to kind of like just get some raw numbers on that. You know, percentage of positive and negative.
So the main point then of your like what this regression is just like you are mentioned in this many times with different.
Yes. Yeah. So that's pretty much the gist.
I'll ask you for this next, I guess the one thing I'm worried about. And or maybe you've looked into is the possibility that some of these like, I don't know, super analyzers, like people who are writing the YouTube videos, processing the information are kind of influencing what the bulk of people believe about the system. And
For sure.
like if their biases or their correct or wrong assumptions are kind of driving what you're seeing.
Yeah, it could be. And I mean, like, there's like an assumption there. I think that like that these influencers are like the most knowledgeable. I do think like these like YouTube guys tend to be like lean a little more towards like people who like are from the South Side, kind of like informal, like one of like the big like kind of like variants of this like content is like guys will like go to a certain gang's like territory and like hang out with them. And like, in fact, a couple of these guys were just witnesses in that court trial I was talking about. So they're definitely like, I mean, I think these are really like the knowledge stakeholders probably. And so getting into that more, like kind of connecting to your question, Julia, that would be interesting. All good here?
All right. Thank you, Riley.
I was wondering